Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
And we want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week. What are you bringing to the table in today's episode?
So I am bringing a piece from Nonprofit Quarterly to the table today. The piece itself is called The Limits of Civil Disobedience, and it was written by Keyvan Golsorkhi and was published just earlier this month, so it's still really new. I actually don't think I had heard of Nonprofit Quarterly before finding this piece, I think. But I looked them up. They're a multimedia organization that is working to advance critical conversations that can help refine nonprofit and social movement policy and practice. That's what's on their website. They've got both, what's really cool is they've got both print and digital platforms. They've also got their own webinars, produced their own podcasts. So they're really kicking out a lot of great content in the world, which is great. This piece that we read for today, I thought it was great in a very broad sense. And we can get into the nitty gritty of what he talks about. Keyvan Golsorkhi explores the notion of civil and uncivil disobedience, the roles that they play in our society, the ways in which we engage them in our everyday lives, as well as in our political engagement and our movements, how they have affected and can affect real change in our society, which, I think is directly connected to all of the things we talk about here on the podcast. So, I really enjoyed this piece. I'm super excited to talk today about it. So let's get into it. What did you think of it?
Yeah, I thought this was great. I really appreciated how he lays out the different aspects of civility that we don't usually unpack. There's a constant demand for civility, which, as he points out throughout the article, means we don't confront people in power when they're out and about, or we don't block traffic, or we don't do anything that inconveniences or confuses people related to protests.
That's right.
Everything is supposed to be some kind of message that everybody can get on board with, which is impossible.
It is orderly and right.
Orderly. I want to talk about that. So it's a request for civility to the system versus civility to another person in an interpersonal relationship, which he highlights is an important element and aspect of society. Like, interpersonal relationships and being civil in those is helpful in general.
Yes.
But being civil in the face of injustice to the injustice itself isn't what we're talking about here.
That's right.
And it makes more sense for us to be uncivil in the face of injustice. And so I just really appreciated a lot of different aspects of this. There's different people he quotes throughout this piece: Olufemi Taiwo, Malcolm X, Dr. King, and a few other people and philosophers. I just think this is a really great critique about what people demand from protests and how it cannot and should not always conform to those demands, because it seeks out a higher calling or a higher call out maybe of the system itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that idea of how we enact civility with each other versus how we enact it in the context of our society, and as you point out, like the systems that oppress us and the injustices that we experience is such a huge part of this piece. So I appreciated that. I think the distinctions between those different aspects of civility was something that he talked about early on in this piece, which I think set the tone for many of his arguments throughout it. So one of the quotes that I pulled from early on in this piece about this was this, quote, "This distinction and how civility is enforced or obscured has important consequences for how we interpret incivility in the face of injustice." In his article, Civility is Overrated, Adam Serwer provides two definitions of civility. The first definition demands kindness to others, what Serwer colorfully calls not being an asshole. The second definition demands passive acceptance of the status quo. The first type of civility affirms the grammar of social life, ensuring the integrity of social norms. The second type of civility, common exploited by the elite, demands acquiescence to how the rules are enforced.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important distinction to understand. I think about it in the sense of we have this social contract with one another and ways in which I think we should be in community with one another as human beings, how we're supporting each other, how we're navigating this world together. But, in my opinion, and I think the piece kind of speaks to this, we don't necessarily have to uphold that same type of contract with our society at large.
Yeah.
In fact, we can't, we shouldn't do that with the white supremacist systems and structures that currently exist and are, oppressing us and are marginalizing folks just because of who they are, and thinking about all of the injustices that folks are experiencing day in and day out. And so I think that quote stood out to me because, Adam Serwer says acquiesce. I just love that word. I think it speaks to this idea that we have to fight for change.
Yeah. And I appreciated that juxtaposition so early on in the piece, because it really does, as you say, lay out the arguments for the rest of the piece.
I remember when I brought this piece, I wasn't quite sure where he was going to go with this, but yes, I appreciated that.
Yeah. And so one of my favorite moments of this article is a quote from Dr. King. And so we're going to talk about order here. Dr. King in this quote is responding to criticism of a plan to disrupt the traffic that is going to the World's Fair in New York in 1964. Dr. King said that movement organizers, quote, do not need allies who are more devoted to order than to justice, and who would prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. It's one of his more, I think, well-known quotes.
Right.
Maybe it's second tier. He's got some ones that, everybody knows and can say, and then he's got some ones that people who actually do the work can say. And this is one of those that I think is usually present among folks who are in it. And so I think it's such an important distinction between order and justice.
Yes.
And if you're committed to order, you're asking for the civility from people, and you're asking for people not to block traffic because it might upset people and steer them away from your cause. And so he goes on to say that the people who are questioning the validity of these tactics, quote, never were real friends of the civil rights movement. Of course, this is a huge point of Golsorkhi's argument and Dr. King's argument. We can be dedicated to order rather than justice, which is when we're quiet.
Yes.
That's when we're dedicated to order. We're dedicated to the status quo, which is what order is. Like you mentioned that in the earlier piece of Golsorkhi's argument. It's a way to ignore the real violence in the history and in the presence of white supremacy and settler colonialism in this country, and the way those things are being spread around the world as well. As we are, quote unquote, spreading democracy around the world. We're really, spreading these other systems of oppression.
I think that's such a spot on analysis, particularly that notion of being spread out around the world, and what staying quiet does, right? It's a invitation for that to continue.
Yeah, it's an acquiescence.
It's an acquiescence. Ooh, ding, ding, ding. Yeah, absolutely. And any use of Dr. King in the way that he meant to come across and be conveyed is powerful. I think the other thing that's important to note about this, and Keyvan shares in this piece, is how this call for civility in the face of white supremacy and settler colonialism, as you call it, is so pervasive in our society. And it's been that way under both liberal and conservative regimes, if you will. And it's a part of the liberal and conservative playbook, both of them. And so Keyvan says this, quote, under both liberal and conservative administrations, the U.S. government has expanded the influence of the elite and shrunk the powers of the public, fortified the security state and enfeebled the welfare system, proselytized radical bipartisanship and criminalized radical dissent. U.S. conservatives tend to be fairly explicit about this agenda, galvanizing support for these measures by demonizing minorities, immigrants, and other marginalized people. The liberal appeal to civility reproduces an order that marginalizes the powerless, but cloaks these efforts behind appeals to social harmony. Mm-hmm. And that actually led into the great quote that you brought up from Dr. King. And so in my mind, and I think what he's trying to communicate here, is that we need disobedience in the face of the status quo. It made me think of Dylan Thomas's great poem. We cannot go quietly or gently into that good night. We have to do that regardless of who is in power, because all of our lives truly depend on it every moment, no matter who's in power. And we see in so many ways that elite, that power always wants to be maintained at the expense of everybody.
Yeah, and this reminds me of elite capture, which
Yes,
we talked about,
yes.
right? Like thinking about using
yes.
the way that Golsorkhi talks about the elite is very similar to the way that Olufemi Taiwo makes arguments in his book Elite Capture. So it just
It's fascinating to me
yeah.
that as much as the word elite was in this, I
Yeah.
never thought about that book, but it's in the title. It's there.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's such a
Great
good
connection.
back to that
Yes.
particular book, which
So good.
was excellent.
So good.
And apparently we read 2 years ago. So,
Yeah.
So one of the other things that I thought about as I read through this article is it reminded me that there was something related in that in these times, what is to be done special issue about the right, which we read a piece from a few weeks ago about whether the left is prepared to meet this moment in the same way that the right has been preparing for decades.
Yes.
So I actually jumped over there to read an article called "The Right's Persecution of Palestine Supporters Looks a Lot Like a New Red Scare" by Nashwa Bawab.
Okay.
And so she says, quote, "What we're seeing is not only the manufacture of consent for genocide against Palestinians, but an attempt to stifle the left, particularly the Muslim left, globally. Germany and France have banned pro-Palestine demonstrations entirely." And there's other parts of the article where she's talking about people having been fired for sharing pro-Palestine perspectives on
Messaging,
social
yeah.
media
Okay.
and all kinds of other things that are happening to folks. But this manufacture of consent for genocide that she mentions is tied directly into how Golsorkhi talks about the way that protesters calling for a ceasefire in Gaza are being told to be civil.
Yes.
Or to acquiesce to how it is that we are choosing to spread quote unquote democracy worldwide through our imperialism in the US, which looks a lot like the imperialism of the Israeli regime.
Yeah.
So, again, this just means we should be quiet. We're supposed to be quiet. We're supposed to accept the status quo, to be civil, or we have to go through the appropriate channels.
Yes.
Which very few people seem to be changing their position when we go through those channels.
Right.
But when we make choices like stopping traffic in the street, people start to take notice differently about what it means. Our uncivil disobedience changes the conversation because people start to pay more attention to it.
Absolutely.
And recognize that this isn't going to go away.
Absolutely. You understand and you see there's a visceral reaction to those kinds of actions. It means it can't be overlooked. It can't be ignored when we're loud, when we are disobedient in the ways in which he's talking about in this piece. And I'm so glad you found this other piece. I'm really struck by, you said this manufacture of consent for genocide. Talk about some powerful words there.
So much said in just a few words.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And such a great connection to what we read in this. So now I'm going to have to check that out. I need you to send me that link. All right. I feel like we're at this point where we're naturally shifting over to application because we're talking about what this disobedience could look like. So this feels like the time to formally shift. Let's talk about application, how this applies to our everyday lives and our work. I can't help but think that this piece is a siren. It's a call to action for all of us to step up and step into the necessary work to fight for, to demand real change in our world so we can actually achieve collective liberation, our collective liberation. To me, this piece, he's saying, this is what we need to do. So one of the things he shares in this piece is about the lessons we can learn and should learn from Dr. King's legacy. I'm so glad you brought him up, and what we were experiencing in the 1960s that, quite frankly, still applies today.
Yeah.
So the quote from the piece that I pulled is this, quote, "In Letters from Birmingham Jail, King defended what he called a constructive tension, or a crisis that the activist engineers to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. Freedom is never voluntarily granted by the oppressor, but it must be demanded. Creating and managing a crisis-packed situation," King emphasized in his letter, "is an important resource for bringing the powerful to the negotiating table. If we learn any lessons from the political terrain in 1964, we should understand that protest is not merely a political spectacle, but a collective action that halts the routine and repetition of the existing order." So, to me, all of this boils down to this imperative that we have to keep our foot on the gas.
Yeah.
We can't only get engaged when there's a crisis or when there's an injustice that's in our face because the news media has picked it up and it's everywhere. I think the thing to note here is that injustices are everywhere. The injustices are constant and they affect all of us. And so the application of this to me is that in whatever way we can disrupt it, we have to. And we have to go hard when we do that. We absolutely do.
Yeah, and we have to build connection and community with other people who are there with us.
Yes.
And so we can rotate in and out too. Because I think, as we know, when you keep your foot on the gas constantly, you run out of gas
You
eventually.
sure do. Yeah.
And so there has to be somebody else there present with you.
Carrying the torch, working with you.
Yeah, I love the application. It just makes me think so much more about the ways that we try to build collective capacity for things,
Yes.
which is a continuous struggle. It's a continuous attempt at creating something new
Yes.
there, I think. But yeah, I love that. My application for this week is from later in the article where Golsorkhi says, "This is the point of disruptive protest, to force a re-examination of collective fealty to ideals of respect and justice." And I love that because it makes us think about what we mean by respect and justice. What is it that we mean, as in we the people, we the actual people,
Right.
versus the people who are in power and are supposed to be upholding these values. And the United States has never had an alignment of stated values with lived reality.
No.
Not for a moment. And so it's not that surprising that we don't now. But I think this forces more people to say, wait, look, the words that are here in this document and in this document and in all of this history stuff that I learned from these old white slave owners, that doesn't line up. None of
Sure
this
doesn't.
adds up. And I think we've been living in a concentrated moment for the last 15 years or so of this reexamination of what respect and justice looks like.
Yeah.
So we've seen Occupy Wall Street, which changed the way we talk about capitalism and wealth inequality.
Right.
We've seen the uprisings in response to Trayvon Martin, which ultimately led to the movement for Black Lives and a lot of other folks getting activated and brought into movement
Yes.
for racial justice. We've seen protests across Europe in response to cuts to the social safety net there, like raising the retirement age.
Right.
We've seen people take to the streets in response to Trump's administration and his policies. We've seen people in the street to stand up for a ceasefire in Gaza.
Yes.
We're in a window of history where regular people are trying to reckon with what the United States says it stands for and the things that it actually does.
Right.
And I think people are re-examining what respect and justice actually means to them, and actually means, like I said, in those documents that allegedly founded our country. And I think that re-examination and people being out in the streets, I hope that it means we're going to end up in a better place.
I hope for that too. Absolutely. And you're right. I think it's been a long time reckoning, a long time coming for folks to finally realize that those founding documents, those values our country believes in or was founded by, they are not the reality of our situation, of our lives. And so this is calling for us to be angry about it, get in the streets about it, do something about it.
Yeah. And I think, too, one of the things that we talked about a few weeks ago is the interconnection between different movements and different fights for justice or liberation.
Yeah.
And the things that I just listed are all connected.
Absolutely.
Especially when you sit back and look at it in 2024, you can see the way that all of those things are connected to each other.
Yes.
And so you can see that it's all the same fight in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's another, I don't know, that's just another thing that came to me as I looked at that listing, and I was like, look, all of this stuff there, this is all interconnected.
Yes.
When we're fighting for economic justice, we're also fighting for racial justice in a way. And when we're fighting for racial justice, we're fighting for justice for people across the world in Gaza. All of these things are interconnected, which is why it's important that the way that we fight against them is in solidarity with one another.
Absolutely. And what you just said, because I'm still reading the book, but it connects to the book that I know you're going to bring this month, Rehearsals for Living, right? Because there's so much of that book and their letters to each other, the author's letters to each other, talk about how our struggles are also interconnected. So not only is the work we're doing interconnected and the fights interconnected, our struggles, our histories, our lives are interconnected as well.
Yes.
So yeah, I just had a moment because I just read a lot of that book today. Very, very good. All right, well, let's talk about homework. What do we want to do when we leave the table today? I continue to just be really intrigued by some of the stuff early on in this piece that Keyvan quoted about civility. So I'd actually love to dig into a little bit of that stuff. That Adam Serwer piece that I shared earlier is from The Atlantic. So I want to read that. Olufemi Taiwo's journal article was also quoted. That's a piece where he's talking about society's moral social structure and civility at large. And so those pieces really piqued my curiosity. So I'd love to check them out. I also want to dig around more on the Nonprofit Quarterly's website to see what else they've got to offer, what else we might be able to bring to the table. As I mentioned, they've got podcasts, they've got webinars, they've got other pieces on a variety of topics. And so there might be more we can bring to the table from them. Yeah. What about you?
My homework's another book.
Hey!
Candace Delmas, a philosopher, wrote a book called A Duty to Resist When Disobedience Should Be Uncivil, which, just the title alone sounds really intriguing. But here's a quote from the description of the book. What are our responsibilities in the face of injustice? Many philosophers argue for what is called political obligation, the duty to obey the law of nearly just, legitimate states. Even proponents of civil disobedience generally hold that, given this moral duty, breaking the law requires justification. By contrast, activists from Henry David Thoreau to the Movement for Black Lives have long recognized a responsibility to resist injustice. Taking seriously this activism, this book wrestles with the problem of political obligation in real-world societies that harbor injustice.
Wow.
Right? So add that to the list.
Add it to the list. Yes, sir. I love it. A duty to resist when disobedience should be uncivil. Got it.
Yeah.
We'll do it. I like it. All right. Well, what a great piece.
Yeah.
Yeah. What a great conversation. Thank you for that, my friend. And speaking of you're up next time.
I am.
What do you bring to the table in our next episode?
Well, as you shared just now.
Oh, spoiler alert.
I'm bringing a book called Rehearsals for Living. It's a collaborative book where Robin Maynard and Leanne Betta-Samosake Simpson write letters back and forth to one another as they sharpen one another's analysis of what liberation could look like and more.
Yes.
The book was published by Haymarket, and this is a quote from the description on their website. Rehearsals is a captivating book, part debate, part dialogue, part lively and detailed familial correspondence between two razor-sharp writers convening on what it means to get free as the world spins into some new orbit. In a genre-defying exchange, the authors collectively envision the possibilities for more liberatory futures during a historic year of indigenous land defense, prison strikes, and global Black-led rebellions against policing. So, if that's not enough, I don't know what is.
That's whoever wrote that. Deserves a raise. That is great.
There's also a foreword by Ruth Wilson Gilmore and an afterword by Robin D.G. Kelly. So this book is chock full of learning. It's chock full of insight. I am looking forward to talking about it with you right here next week.
Absolutely. I am too. I'm looking forward to finishing it. I'm so close, but I love that piece from the description about familial correspondence. It's such that you can sense some vulnerability in their letters, and obviously they have a close relationship to be able to talk about what it is that they're experiencing, what's going on with their children, their families, but then to also be full of such incredible wisdom. There is so much to learn from this book.
Yeah.
So I'm very much so looking forward to talking about it next time. Very good. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. And you know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with everyone you know, follow us on the socials, including Instagram and TikTok, check us out on YouTube, and sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. Remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.